thank you for speaking with us. We're very honored to meet with you. We have to ask you a very serious, important question first, which one of our colleagues asked us to ask you, which is, do you have Oasis tickets?
Do I have Oasis tickets? No, I don't. No, I don't.
Okay. Are you under pressure to get some for the family?
Not yet, but I fear it may be coming. It's obviously going to be a big event, and I love the music, so.
Because their visit was a moment of cool Britannia.
It was, although I always say that I was so busy when I came in as Prime Minister that this first party where they were there and various other people were there, I actually had nothing to do with it. I didn't even know the party was on until I walked into Downing Street and they said, we've got a whole event going on upstairs. But anyway, it was nice to see them all. Those are the days.
That was then.
Cool Britannia, yeah.
Your books are a fascinating read, but it's a very unusual format. I read one reviewer described it as like The Prince, but without the malice. I wondered, why did you decide to write it?
Because the thing about being a political leader is that everyone thinks it's just about politics. But actually, when you get into government, you realize, maybe winning government was about being the great communicator, but being in government, you've got to be a great chief executive. And there's a whole skill set that is attributable to the profession in the same way that you would have a skill set attributable to any profession. But we don't look at politics like that, or government. And so, I learned lessons from governing on the job, as it were, and afterwards in the work we now do in roughly over 40 countries actually worldwide. And I thought it's absurd there's no guide for leaders when these are the things that I know that they will want to have answers to, and the things that will be troubling them when they reach this position of extraordinary power. Because where else in life would you put someone in a job of enormous importance with actually zero qualifications? I mean, you would never do that in your job or running a company, or, you wouldn't, if Manchester United decided to change their coach, you wouldn't just go into the stands and say, give me the most enthusiastic fan and put them in charge. No, it would be people would say, you're insane to do that. But politics works in this way. And so I wanted to write it, and I wanted to write it simply. And actually, The Prince is very simple chapters, but I wanted to write it in simple chapters. I said to the publishers, I can write you something 3 times as long, 4 times as weighty, and 5 times as boring. But if you actually want a leader to read it, you just keep it simple and clear. And the best feedback I've had on it is actually from people who are in government, not here simply, but abroad. Several of my friends who are leaders in government, as I said, because they realize you get it, and you understand that this is the biggest problem. You're still doing politics, but actually one part of the job is the hard intellectual study of systems, of how you make change, of how you introduce new things. And you've got to keep on persuading people, but actually in the end, you deliver by implementation.
I read in, I think one of the interviews you've done recently that you would have stayed in power if you could have done, but also that you didn't enjoy a lot of your time in power, and there are only sort of perhaps 2 or 3 moments that really stand out. Do you prefer your life now?
I prefer my life now in the sense that it's much less stressful. And recently, as the Institute's grown, I think I feel much more professionally fulfilled, and I think we can build this into a really, really big organization, which will last. So I think now I'm in the right place, but it's, you've got to be honest with yourself. You don't have the same power that you have when you're actually Prime Minister,
Would you go back if you could?
I never waste time thinking about that because I don't think it's ever possible, so.
But that sounds like, yes, I would if I could.
It's actually, it sounds like I really haven't thought about it enough as an actual thing, because it's not an actual thing. So, and my wife always says to me, you might think of going back until you remember what it was actually like.
David Cameron recently went back. Would you ever answer an SOS?
I I don't think that would be, he fulfilled a particular function. Actually, I think he did it well as at a particular moment in time. But I don't think that, I can't see an equivalent for me.
So reflecting on what you've just said, would you have any advice for Keir Starmer at the moment, based on your book?
No, because I think it's really important that he doesn't have people kind of yapping at him from the sidelines, you know, and saying, oh, I was a former leader. And by the way, one of the things I've learned since leaving office is it's a darn sight easier to give the advice than do the job. So it's all about having a plan for recovery of the country and implementing it. And he knows that and doesn't need me to tell him.
Do you think perhaps he needs to offer the electorate a little bit more hope?
Well, I think he will. He is and will try to, but he's also going to be frank with people that it is difficult. I mean, and it is difficult. You know, we're since Brexit, we've had 6 prime ministers. I mean, he's the 6th, I think, in 8 years. And you know, we've not had a clear direction because we've been chopping and changing all the time. So I think that's a big challenge that he's got. And you know, it's going to be, it's not going to be a fast recovery, but he's got to lay the foundations to do it.
To switch to the Mideast and recent news, you've said recently that peace in the Middle East is possible. Do you still believe that? And if so, how?
Yeah, it's possible because you've got to, so when I went back to Israel a couple of weeks ago, it was my 271st visit, I think we worked out, since leaving office.
To Israel?
Yeah. So, and I have, you know, we have an office in Israel, we have offices in the Middle East. I go there very, very often. I've been in this thing for 25 years or more. And so I don't claim to be an expert in all areas of foreign policy, but I know quite a lot about this. And I think you've got to look at it in 2 different ways. The immediate crises, Gaza, Lebanon, and so on, Iran. And then you've got to look at it to take a step back and ask, what's the big picture in the Middle East? Because what that big picture represents is the answer to the question of whether there's hope in the Middle East or not. And the big picture, in my view, is all to do with whether the countries of the Middle East can evolve their societies towards societies of religious tolerance, where belief in God is between you and God, and you don't turn politics into religion into a political ideology. And secondly, whether you have modern connected economies in which your young people believe they're part of the modern world economically. And those, you know, that requires rule-based economies that are vibrant and where people of enterprise can form enterprises and do well. And, you know, all over the Middle East, that battle is going on. And it's a battle between, you know, I always say to people, you've got to distinguish between Islam and Islamism. You know, Islam is the religion. Islamism is the turning of the religion into a political ideology, which will necessarily be totalitarian, exclusivist, and basically economically backward. So that's the choice for the Middle East. And you can see these competing visions going on all the time. Now, I personally believe that the human spirit will ultimately propel the Middle East towards modernization, but that's the question.
And is there anything the West can do to push that in the direction you'd like to see?
Support the modernizers. That's what we should be doing. And be very clear that about the influence of Iran, which is the representation of one part of that Islamist coalition, effectively, as it is now. Because I've always said to people, and people think that because Iran is the Islamic Republic of Iran, but it's Shia, and the Muslim Brotherhood is Sunni, people say, oh, well, they're never going to work together, but they will work together against the West because they understand that the values represented by religious tolerance and modernization are values that are antithetical to their cause.
You write in your book about the paralysis of the United Nations as a result of the growing alliance between China and Russia. And we saw yesterday this was sort of backed up with Guterres being declared persona non grata in Israel. What's the future for the United Nations? How can it be strengthened and become influential again?
It's a really good question. I mean, it's you see, I am opposed to trying to isolate China or disengage from China, because I think China's got every right to be a big global power and to exercise influence economically and politically on the world stage. The problem is it has, I don't quite understand why, but it has decided to be in this alliance with Russia, with Iran, North Korea. You know, as I always say, it's a club that shouldn't have a long waiting list, but it is, you know, you've got to say it. It is a thing today. And what that means is that United Nations is really, because you've got two permanent members that are basically going to be pretty much in opposition to the other three. Okay. Now, I think in the end, the reason why you can't and shouldn't isolate China is because they have the right to exercise influence, and because there are issues, climate change, global health, stability of the economy, actually controlling some of the behavior of the other members of the club, in which we need China. But it's hard to see how the United Nations functions in that, with that political, confrontation. So I think it's really hard to, it could be, what I always say to people is, you also got to keep an open mind about China, because since the People's Republic of China was created, they've gone through many iterations. It's not been one straight line from 1949 to today. On the contrary, they've gone through periods of, where the Communist Party wanted to control everything. You went through the Cultural Revolution. They went through opening up. They're now in a situation where if I was a Chinese leader, I'd still find it a little uncertain what our strategy was for the future. Because in the end, China's a strong civilization, very, very talented people. Does it really profit them to be, isolated from the West? I can't see it myself. And therefore, I think what's important from the Western perspective is to keep lines of communication open, and also to try and see the world through Chinese eyes, because I think there's always a risk with the West that we see everything through Western eyes, and we shouldn't forget that for China, they think they're the center of the world, not us. So, and that is not a creation of the modern Communist Party. It's the Chinese have always thought that.
Could I ask about another member of that club you just mentioned, which is Russia? So I'm curious to know how you found dealing with Putin personally, but also how should the West approach that issue now?
Well, with Putin, I always say to people, I don't know whether he was always like he is now and we didn't spot it, or he changed. I mean, I tend to the he changed view, because the Putin that I first met was very open, very much wanting to create ties with the West. We used to meet in St. Petersburg, which is the Western-facing part of Russia. And, the conversation then was all about Russia's place in the world as a modernizing force. And, people even used to talk at one point about, well, is it possible for Russia to join the European Union? We used to invite Russia to NATO meetings. The G7 was the G8. It was still the G8 by the time I left office, by the way. So the idea that the West kind of sort of pushed Russia away or tried to isolate them, it's just not true. On the contrary, we were always thinking of ways that we could bind Russia to us. But in the end, he opted against the modernization of his economy and in favor of nationalism, which is what people default to when they find economic change too hard. And the recreation of the Russian Empire, which it's not possible to do. And I always say to people, Ukraine could have decided to go with Russia. So if I was Putin, I'd be asking, why did they decide not to?
And that's economic, in your view?
And political. Why do they want to be part of Europe? Because people want to be part of that prosperity in Europe, despite all the problems. I mean, look at Poland today. Look at Poland and Ukraine at the end of the Cold War, 1992. I think at that time they would have been roughly equal in GDP per head, roughly. I mean, you look at it today, Poland's now a successful modern country, right? Because they're part of the European Union. And okay, their politics may be difficult and they have all sorts of political crises from time to time, but the people are free. Would the people choose to be under the Soviet Union or Putin's Russia? No. So the people in Ukraine, and you've got a whole new young generation in Ukraine that are, they want to be connected to the world. And therefore, yes, it's economic, but it's also political. And that's why the idea that you could ever stop them doing that by force and remove a democratically elected president of a country has never been a problem to anyone. And, the people would then say, okay, we're happy to be back in the Russian Empire under the Putin system of government. I mean, I don't know how anyone could ever have thought that they would accept that.
But what is the future of that conflict? I mean, can Ukraine win?
Well, it depends what winning means. The most important thing is that the conflict ends in a way that doesn't reward Russian aggression. So quite how you put that into specifics, that's a matter for negotiation. But the important thing is for the West to give Ukraine every support in order to bring about an agreement. I mean, it won't end like the First World War or the Second World War, right? And once you understand that, there's going to be some form of agreement, but it's important Ukraine's in a strong negotiating position, and that's why we have to support them.
In the presidential debate, Vice President Harris said, yes, the US wants Ukraine to win. And former President Trump did not say that, would not say that. Is that a problem? Is he wrong?
I think it depends what happens. I can't believe that any American president would want Russia to come out of this feeling it had gained a victory. Because, by the way, that would have big implications for how China feels about American power. Okay, but anyway, let's see. I mean, I don't know. And if you're about to ask me a slew of questions about who I want to win and what I think of the American election, save the trouble, because I really don't want to get into it. Who knows? And it's the job of the British Prime Minister, or even a former British Prime Minister, to work with whoever comes out on top in the election.
But what will be the issues, do you think, if Harris wins versus if Trump?
I think it's really hard to judge, because what I've learned over time with American presidents is to judge them by what they do, not by their election campaign that can often say all sorts of things.
In your book, you talk about the failure of centrist politics to take strong positions on immigration and some culture war issues, and that contributed to the rise of Donald Trump to the presidency. Do you think, therefore, that the Obama administration could have been stronger on immigration? And are we witnessing the same thing this time around with the Biden and Harris administration?
I mean, I don't know enough about the details of the policy in the US, but in general terms, I think there are two issues that centrist politicians need to deal with. One is because centrism should never be the splitting of the difference between left and right. It's not what it's about. And actually, centrism, I don't like the term, but I can't think of a easier shorthand. It's really what I think of it of is as a sort of post-ideological, in the sense of post-left-right. I think left-right means a lot more to party activists than it really does to the public anymore. Because I think most people want solutions to problems and don't really believe that arises from a sort of leftist ideology around the state or a rightist ideology around the market. So you've got to deal with immigration, because it's a big problem for people. So any politician running for office in the West has got to have a strong policy on immigration. What does strong mean? It means that you have in place a system of controlling immigration. I think the majority of people will support immigration with controls. What they won't support is an uncontrolled system that means that whether people get into your country and stay there or not is an accident of their own determination to come in, rather than a deliberate policy of government that you should be here. And I think, okay, some people are anti-immigrant, some people are racist, but I don't think they're a majority in any Western country. And I think it's a big mistake for people on the progressive or liberal side of politics to kind of conflate anxiety about a lack of control with racism, because the two things are different, completely different. One is a perfectly understandable anxiety about uncontrolled entry into your country. The other is obviously, wrong. But if you don't have rules, you get prejudices. That's what I always say to people. That's why you've got to have strong positions on it.
And does that mean moving further to the right on immigration?
Well, I don't regard it as moving further to the right. It's like when I was always campaigning for Labour to be the party of law and order. I said, what's right-wing about saying that poor communities that suffer most from drug dealers and crime and gangs, that they should be protected against it? I don't think it's a right-wing move. I think it's just a sensible thing. I mean, you need to have control in immigration. Otherwise, by the way, it's not fair on the people who want to migrate lawfully. If the system's so porous you could migrate unlawfully, it's got a whole set of consequences that are bad, including fueling anti-immigrant sentiment when really it's fueling, it should be fueling an anti-chaos sentiment.
What implications do you think that might have for concepts like freedom of movement in Europe, for instance?
Well, freedom of movement in Europe, you see, because people often say to me, well, you had a very open immigration policy. We absolutely didn't. But we did have, because we were part of the European Union, a freedom of movement. Now, I will say to people, if I'd been aware and still in office that we were getting large numbers of people coming from Eastern Europe and particular communities were suddenly being, very large numbers of people coming in, I would have been acting on it. We could have done lots of things within the freedom of movement rules, as other countries did, in order to tighten and restrict the ability of people to move, particularly their ability to move and claim benefit. Okay, so but for me, freedom of movement, provided you did have that focus on removing any problems with it, is a good thing, not a bad thing. It allows people to move around in Europe very easily. And nowadays, what's Britain done as a result of ending freedom of movement and getting out of the European Union? First of all, people just have long queues at airports. And secondly, we've substituted often single Europeans coming and working in our hospitality industry, which needed them. And we've substituted for those people from Asia and Africa, often who have families that come with them. So it's just, and immigration's higher. I mean, the day I left office, immigration was about half the level as it is today. But it's, these are, so I think freedom of movement, it's, Europe itself, if we'd argued this case properly, in my view, Europe itself would have allowed even greater restrictions where there were obvious problems for countries. Because it's a problem everywhere in Europe. When you get sudden movements of people and, your infrastructure has to adapt. So you need schools for them, you need hospitals for them, right? So if that happens, people get anxious about it. But there are ways of dealing with that without abandoning the whole concept, which is integral to the single market, that you have freedom of people and capital.
Can I ask, have you met Donald Trump?
Yeah.
And what's your take on him?
Well, as I say, I don't give takes on people, but I worked with the US administration, his administration, on the Abraham Accords, which was a huge thing and really important. And, I found it a perfectly good working relationship.
Back to the Mideast and the Abraham Accords, is there a hope still for a two-state solution, and is that the right goal?
I think it is the right goal, but you've got to be realistic about why it hasn't happened. I mean, it won't happen unless the politics of both sides are in a position which is conducive to it. And, we did the Northern Ireland Agreement, and I, always said to people is, if you have two peoples that are living side by side in a relatively small territory, and actually if you take the whole of Israel and the Palestinian territories, I think you correct me if I'm wrong with this, but you can basically fit that in New York State just about, okay? So if they're living side by side and they're in conflict with each other, then there are only two solutions. One is that they make peace, which is what we managed to bring about in Northern Ireland, or the second is that the stronger one will police the weaker one. They'll sit on the weaker one.
Until what, forever?
Well, that's the point. It doesn't work forever. And that's why I was one of the very few people going around the Middle East in these last years before October the 7th, saying, I promise you, we're not going to be able to manage this situation. We've got to solve it. And people would say to me, I had this conversation with many of the leaders in the region, they'd say to me, look, don't talk to us about this Palestinian issue anymore. It's too difficult and we've got other things to do. And I would say, no, it's really important because ultimately it's not the cause of the problems in the region. This is a mistake. But it is used by people who want to cause problems in the region to cause even more problems. So it's important to resolve it if you can, and it will only be resolved if the Israelis feel that these people living side by side with them culturally accept them.
And do they?
At the moment, no, there's a huge breach between the two. The Israelis don't trust the Palestinians don't trust the Israelis. And you've got a situation where the Palestinians feel deprived and humiliated and angry, and the Israelis feel these people want to destroy us, right? So this is why I kept saying to people, because we'd have these endless negotiations that would be about the precise running of the boundary and, what would happen to this part or that part of the issues at stake. And I would say to people, yeah, but all of these things become easier to resolve if you have created an environment in which people feel there's actually acceptance of the other. But if you don't have that environment, then you're never going to make these agreements stick. You might make them, but they won't work. And, in the end, in Northern Ireland, what happened was, we got the unionists to accept, ultimately, that the price of the union was to treat people fairly, right? And you couldn't say, well, we're a majority, and therefore we're just going to run everything. So we had to have power sharing, right? So that was a big concession from unionism. The big concession from Republicans and nationalists was that the Northern Ireland should remain part of the UK unless a majority of people in Northern Ireland decided they wanted to shift, right? So these two things, and then the absence of violence, because we agreed then we were going to negotiate around this with, a permanent ceasefire, then of course the atmosphere became much better. And then you ended up in a situation where Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley were sitting down together, which is a situation, you guys know you're British, right? Yeah. Most people, well, when I was growing up, would have thought it was completely insane that would ever happen. That's why I say to people, it's not impossible to have an agreement. And actually, one thing about the Middle East is, in Northern Ireland, we've created a peace framework and agreement, and we got peace there, when we've never resolved the final question, which is United Kingdom or United Ireland. Actually, most people in the international community, at least, think the two-state solution is the right one. So there's an agreed goal. So the question is, how do you produce the environment in which both sides think it's possible?
And for the Mideast, what is the answer, if any?
Well, you're just going to have to start with Gaza, because you need to stop the war in Gaza. And the only way of stopping it is to agree that the Israelis shouldn't run Gaza and Hamas shouldn't run Gaza.
I mean, who should agree that? The United States certainly agrees, but I don't see the parties involved agreeing.
Well, the parties involved, I think, would agree it, actually. But you have to then say, well, what is going to govern Gaza? And that's a difficult question.
What's the next step, the one next step you would like to see the West take or the parties involved take?
Get a plan for the day after in Gaza.
Of who would run it and...
Yeah, and get the hostages released and, get back to a situation where, I mean, I'm a strong supporter of Israel, but it doesn't mean to say I can't see that the situation for people in Gaza is desperate and awful. So you've got to bring it to an end, and that would at least give you something from which you could then build for the future.
Do you think the United States, either Biden or Trump or Harris, has the throw weight to push Israel?
Yeah, it's not just a question of pushing Israel, though. You've got to have a plan that both sides think is fair, but it starts from an understanding, as I say, that Israel shouldn't be running Gaza and Hamas shouldn't be running Gaza. So after that, you can start to think how you construct the right formula for it. But that's and yeah, of course, America's always got the weight to do these things if it wants to.
Do you think so?
Yeah.
What would be the way to do that?
Well, yeah, I mean, without going into the details of it, I mean, yeah, and America's still. I think what's strange to me is that America has this curious sort of lack of confidence in itself in one way at the moment, when I think America has re-emerged in the past few years as easily the strongest country in the world. Just a question of how it uses that strength. It's got the biggest military by far and best. It's got the most resilient economy. It's the world's largest oil producer, the world's largest gas producer, and it's got all of the major technology companies. I mean, it's a really strong country.
But again, what would you do?
Huh?
What would you actually do?
Well,
because I remember in the Troubles, George Mitchell, I think, said, you can't be ahead of the parties.
No,
you can have a peace plan, but if they don't have the same urge, it doesn't matter.
I don't want to go into the detail because I'm still sort of semi-involved in some of these things, but I put it like this, I am sure there is a way through. There's got to be a way through, because otherwise you'll just leave this Gaza as in a state of, if you don't have an alternative plan, and it's not the Israelis, it's not Hamas, it's going to be complete anarchy, and that would be a very bad thing. Most of all for the Gazans, but also for the whole region.
Do you think Israel's degrading of Iranian proxies is going to take us closer to that goal?
Well, the origin of the instability in the Middle East is in the activity of Iran. There's no doubt in my mind about that at all. And the Iranian people are not our problem. Again, Iran is a huge civilization, and it's got some wonderfully talented people. A lot of them have found their way to America and here and doing great things. I was actually with a leading American businessman yesterday who was Iranian in origin. But they believe in exporting this revolution, and they use these proxies to do it, and they cause. I mean, Lebanon needs to be liberated from Hezbollah. I mean, the Lebanese, again, I mean, what an amazing people. You see the Lebanese around the world. I mean, incredible business people. Really, actually Beirut, I speak to a lot of friends who still go there and say, even despite everything in these last times, Beirut's still a vibrant city. We need a way through. And that's why it's really important, if we can, to revive the Saudi-Israel-American deal, because that would give people confidence that Iranian power is going to be pushed back against hard, which is what you need to do. Because in the end, What are they trying to do? You want to destroy Israel? Well, that's never going to happen. So you're going to create a situation where you're in constant conflict over that. You try and, this Islamist, this is what alarms me when I see bits of the progressive left in the West allying themselves with people who claim to be pro-Palestinian, but actually are heavily influenced by Islamist ideology. When, there's nothing progressive about that ideology at all. It's completely backward. Suppresses women, thinks that, you should have legal systems governed by religious law. It's who wants to live like that?
How dangerous do you think it is for Iran to get nuclear capability?
It shouldn't.
It shouldn't, and what should the US or Israel or whomever be allowed to do?
Without going into the details, which are pretty obvious, it should make sure that doesn't happen. If you end up with Iran with a nuclear weapon, it'll be a very, very dangerous situation for the world. And you'll spark a nuclear arms race right across the region, that's for sure.
But Biden said, I think today, perhaps, that he would not support Israel taking out any Iranian nuclear facilities.
Well, these are...
Is that what he's just saying in public?
No, but it's not that, but there's all sorts of questions about what is the best way to ensure that Iran doesn't get that capability, and I'll leave that topic, I think.
We just had a couple more questions, and then we've got a couple of readers' questions, if you wouldn't mind, sort of quick fire. On the royal family.
Right.
Okay. I'd be interested to know what your views were on Boris Johnson coming out and talking about the Queen's cancer diagnosis in his book.
I haven't really caught up with Boris's book. I've got my own book.
Yeah.
I'm not promoting Boris's. No, I have not the faintest idea. What did he?
He said that she'd been suffering with bone cancer for over a year, and he knew that the end was nigh. And basically, the criticism of him is that it's not his place to talk about that.
You've got lots of people who criticise Boris, but you can leave me out of that one.
Okay.
Do you think the royal family, they're under pressure to apologize for slavery and the slave trade, not just say it was a terrible thing? Do you think that King Charles will?
I think all of these arguments, you can go back over history and you end up in a completely absurd position. I've no idea what Winston Churchill's views are on transgender, right? I don't suppose he was ever asked, and he probably never thought about it, but who knows? But supposing it was found that he had, let's say, not entirely modern views on this, which is quite possible, does that mean he was a bad guy? It's just, I think this...
But if the Commonwealth countries, if many of them want the British to apologize for slavery...
Of course, slavery was a horrible thing. It should never have happened.
There's a difference between saying there's a horrible thing that shouldn't have happened and we were wrong.
Of course we were wrong.
But should the king say that?
Well, it's up to him to say it. But it's not... What are people trying to prove here? Of course he thinks it's wrong. And of course, when you look back in history, you say, well, those things were terrible. And, to be fair, there were people at the time saying it was terrible. And in the end, the activities of Wilberforce and others managed to bring about change. But what does it really profit anyone to go back over these things? I think it's the sort of gestures that I think, the most important thing we can do for countries that have been marked by colonialism is to help them now, which we do, and we should do more of. And my institute works in a lot of these countries, and the single most important thing is not to go back over, what happened in the 19th century, but to help them reap the benefits of particularly the technology revolution of the 21st century. So I'm not very big on that. It's really, these are sort of campaigns that kind of get off the ground, and then you put people in a position where if the king's not saying that, then people say, well, in that case, he's sort of supporting slavery or something, which he obviously isn't. So
we have reader questions. As Barney mentioned, we put out a call. What would you like to ask Tony Blair? So can we do a lightning round? First question from Sigrid Klaus. Do you think Ukraine can win this war, or can there be a peace deal? We asked
I
that,
think
but
we've
asking.
answered that. I mean, the truth is they can win in the sense that Russian aggression is not rewarded. And yes, I think there can be a peace deal. There's got to be one in the end.
So our reader Goodness Nicolo has asked a related question, which again we've touched on briefly, but she would like to know, what should the US, UK, EU, NATO and other multilateral organisations, including the UN, be doing in the long run to tame Russia?
I think to make it clear that it can't succeed, that you've got to create a situation in which neither this Russian president nor any successor Russian president thinks he's going to gain anything by the type of aggression that President Putin has taken against Ukraine. So that's the most important thing, and that's why you need a strong alliance. It's why today the transatlantic alliance between America and Europe remains extremely important and should be powerful.
We've got a question from Ava Etemadzadar, who is an Iranian-British woman. And she says she's very concerned about the current situation in the Middle East, particularly the escalation over the past year. In your opinion, what does the international community need to do to ensure that this escalation and tensions are addressed?
Well, I think, as I say, to solve the immediate problems, particularly in respect of Gaza, but then to again make Iran understand that its attempt to exercise power either on its own or with proxies against countries in the region will be pushed back against hard.
Andrew Fulbrock, what's your biggest regret from your time in office as Prime Minister?
I always say, it's for me to know and others to find out. But I mean, I in the book, I'm very open about post 9/11 and, the belief that I think turned out to be much harder than we ever imagined to put democracy in place, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. And in domestic policy, the reform agenda, I would have probably started earlier and gone further. But, I don't spend a lot of time looking back over the past because you can't alter it.
This is not a reader question, but we noticed in your book you don't mention George W. Bush, which seems an odd thing to...
Well, because I mentioned him a lot in my autobiography. And I had a very strong relationship with him and have both a friendship and respect for him. I just haven't mentioned him because he's not particularly relevant to the subjects I was talking about, which are about, government, and often government in the developing world.
Are you still in touch with him?
Yeah, no, sure, of course. Absolutely. And it's, I had a strong relationship both with President Clinton and with him. And then I worked with President Obama. As I say, I worked a bit with President Trump, so I work now with this administration, yeah.
And a final question from Ian Bellis, who says that he really enjoyed your book. Well done, Ian. What piece or two of advice or information on leadership is the most universal? I guess sort of addressing, your book is a sort of direct manual for leaders, but it's also can be applied to other walks of life.
Yeah, no, it can. I mean, I think the most important thing is to have a very clear direction and build a good team. I mean, I think those are the two things that you need. You need to know exactly where you're trying to get to and where you're going. And people often come into positions of leadership and they kind of they're managing their lives and the problems, but they don't have a very clear idea of what they really want to do. So you've got to have that clarity. And that's true whether you're running a company, a football team, or a community centre, frankly, as well as a country. And then, building the right team is, a good team of people is always vital. I mean, I say in the book, it's so obvious you barely need to say it that it's all about the people, but it is all about the people. And often you forget that.
What does the media get wrong about you? And has that changed over the years?
How long you got? We could do. We could.
Well, we're the media, so we want to hear.
Look, I've been through various incarnations. I was Bambi at one stage and Stalin at another, and
A poodle, I believe.
and a poodle, and I don't know what else really. I don't give that a lot of thought. You're probably in a better place to judge than me.
But we know what the media said, but we don't know what we got wrong.
I mean, I think the thing that they usually get wrong about most politicians is that despite appearances, you do actually come in to try and make the world better. Most politicians do. But it's a hard job. And one of the things that I think is really important for people to understand, because there's much less deference towards politicians today. In the old days, when my dad was active in the Conservative Party and back in the 50s and 60s, people treated politicians with a certain respect, and okay, things were still difficult, but there we are. But today, that doesn't happen. And I think what it means is that people forget how hard it is to govern. It's a very difficult job. I often say this to business people who say to me, well, government should be doing this and that. And I say, well, you should go in and try. You find it a lot harder than you think. And so I just think it's important that there isn't created around politics a sense that it's all just about personal advantage. And because most people, if they rise to the very top in politics, most people could have done something else and probably been near the top of that too. So they've chosen politics, and usually they choose it because they believe in it. Not always, but in my experience.
Young people are very disaffected, we find, and despairing, not just politics and war, but climate and other things. Do you have anything to say to them about being hopeful about the future, or are they right to be as depressed and scared as they are?
Yeah, I've got two things to say. First of all, a lot of the pessimism in the West is because we're in the West, which has got challenges it's got to overcome. But in the work my institute does in many countries in the world, which are many, many times poorer than our country, people are quite optimistic. And if you take a step back, over the last 30 years, the world's lifted more people out of poverty than ever before. The world life expectancy in Africa is going up, not down. Deaths from the killer diseases are down. If you talk to the new middle class in China or India, well, they think life's going quite well. So the first thing I say to young people is don't look at all this through Western eyes. But secondly, if you don't like something, get involved. But it's like on climate change, the decisions are difficult. And that's why one of the problems in modern politics is that a lot of debate is refracted through these NGOs and campaign groups in whose interest it is always to tell you, there's a simple solution. It's like people say, just stop oil or something. Okay, we're just going to stop it. I mean, if you want solutions, get involved and get into the detail. And, you'll find it both much more exciting and more rewarding, but also more challenging.
Thank you so much, sir.
That
was fascinating.
Thank you so much. Really nice to see you.